"You're just a scared little boy, Hulk." Jake Roberts' voice cut through the backstage corridor like venom from his pet snake. But the master of mind games had no idea he just awakened something in Hulk Hogan that would destroy him psychologically in 6 minutes. What happened next would remind Jake why you never challenge a legend's courage. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Jake the Snake Roberts stood there with that twisted smile, believing he'd just delivered the perfect psychological blow to wrestling's biggest hero. His dark hair hung over his cold eyes, and everything about his posture suggested a predator who'd just cornered his prey. But Jake had made a critical mistake. He'd attacked the one thing that Hulk Hogan would never allow anyone to question: his courage. The confrontation started because Jake was bitter, consumed by jealousy that had been eating at him for months. He'd been wrestling for 15 years, perfecting the dark art of psychological warfare, becoming the master of mind games that made grown men afraid to step into the ring with him. His DDT finisher had ended careers. His promos had left opponents shaking with genuine fear. His snake Damien had become one of the most feared gimmicks in wrestling history. Yet here was Hulk Hogan, with his colorful outfits and simple good versus evil storylines, getting all the glory, all the money, all the recognition that Jake felt he deserved. While Jake crafted complex psychological narratives that explored the darker aspects of human nature, Hulk was becoming a mainstream phenomenon, with children wearing his merchandise and parents accepting wrestling as family entertainment. The injustice of it burned in Jake's gut. He was an artist, a master craftsman of psychological manipulation who could make audiences genuinely uncomfortable with the depths of human darkness he portrayed. But Hulk was the one getting movie deals, endorsement contracts, and recognition as the face of professional wrestling. "You heard me, Hulkster," Jake continued, his voice dripping with contempt and years of accumulated resentment. "Underneath all that yellow and red, all those vitamins and prayers, all that manufactured heroism, you're nothing but a scared little boy pretending to be a hero. I see right through you. I see the fear in your eyes when you look at someone like me." The accusation was carefully crafted, designed to hit every insecurity that Jake imagined a performer like Hulk must carry. Jake understood that heroes were made, not born, and he believed that manufactured heroes like Hulk were ultimately fragile constructs that could be destroyed by someone who understood their psychological weak points. Several wrestlers had gathered in the narrow backstage area, drawn by the unmistakable sound of Jake Roberts launching one of his legendary psychological attacks. Everyone in the wrestling business knew what Jake could do with words. He could get inside a man's head and destroy his confidence before they ever stepped through the ropes. Veterans twice his size had been reduced to nervous wrecks by Jake's mental warfare. The corridor itself seemed to amplify the tension. It was a typical wrestling venue backstage area, narrow, dimly lit, with concrete walls that absorbed sound and created an atmosphere of claustrophobia that made every confrontation feel more intense. This was where wrestlers settled disputes, where reputations were made and broken, where the real business of professional wrestling took place away from cameras and crowds. But as they watched Hulk's reaction to being called a scared little boy, something felt different about this confrontation. Jake's usual victims would show signs of uncertainty by now, would begin to display the psychological cracks that Jake's mind games were designed to create. Instead, Hulk wasn't backing down, wasn't showing any sign of the fear and self-doubt that Jake's attacks typically generated. Hulk was standing perfectly still, his massive frame completely relaxed, his breathing calm and controlled. His eyes were locked on Jake, with an intensity that made everyone watching understand that something significant was building beneath the surface. There was no fear in those eyes, no uncertainty, no indication that Jake's psychological warfare was having its intended effect. For exactly 6 minutes, Hulk said nothing. Not a word, not a gesture, not even acknowledgement that Jake had spoken. He simply stood there, looking directly at the self-proclaimed master of psychological warfare, with the kind of calm that suggested he was processing not just what Jake had said, but everything he knew about the man who'd said it. Those 6 minutes were torture for Jake. His entire professional identity was built around his ability to manipulate opponents psychologically, to get inside their heads and control their emotional responses. He thrived on reaction, fed off the fear and uncertainty his words created in opponents. Silence was his enemy, because silence meant his psychological weapons weren't working. As the seconds ticked by, Jake began to shift uncomfortably. He ran his hand through his dark hair, adjusted his stance, looked around at the other wrestlers, as if seeking validation for his attack on Hulk's courage. But the other wrestlers were watching this confrontation with the kind of fascination reserved for witnessing something historically significant. Jake's confidence began to crack under the weight of Hulk's unwavering stare. The silence was becoming unbearable, exposing Jake's attack as what it really was, a desperate attempt by an insecure performer to diminish someone whose success he resented. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was exactly 6 minutes of complete silence, Hulk spoke. His voice was quiet, controlled, carrying none of the theatrical energy that characterized his television appearances. This was not Hulk Hogan the character speaking, this was Terry Bollea the man, and somehow that made his words infinitely more powerful. "Jake," Hulk said, and somehow that single word carried more threat than any shouted challenge could have delivered. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." The response caught Jake completely off guard. He had expected anger, expected Hulk to rise to the bait, and engage in the kind of heated exchange where Jake's superior verbal skills and psychological manipulation techniques would give him the advantage. What he didn't expect was this calm, measured response that suggested Hulk was operating on a completely different level than anyone else in the wrestling business. Before Jake could deploy his usual arsenal of psychological manipulation, before he could launch into one of his legendary mind game speeches, Hulk continued in that same deadly quiet tone. "You want to talk about being scared, Jake? Let me tell you what real fear looks like. Real fear is being so insecure about your own place in this business that you have to attack someone else's courage to make yourself feel better. Real fear is knowing that no matter how good you are at mind games, no matter how dangerous you pretend to be, you'll never connect with people the way I do." The words hit Jake like physical blows, each one targeting a specific insecurity that he'd spent years trying to hide behind his dark persona and psychological warfare tactics. Hulk wasn't just defending himself, he was systematically dismantling Jake's entire professional identity while demonstrating a level of psychological sophistication that Jake had never expected from someone he'd dismissed as a simple good guy character. But Hulk wasn't finished. The 6 minutes of silence hadn't been wasted time. They'd been calculation time during which he'd identified every weakness in Jake's psychological armor and prepared a response that would be devastating in its accuracy and comprehensiveness. "You think I'm scared, Jake? I've headlined WrestleMania 3 times in front of crowds that most wrestlers can only dream about. I've carried this entire industry on my shoulders for 5 years, making it acceptable for families to watch, bringing in new audiences who never cared about wrestling before I showed them what it could be. I've got kids from coast to coast who believe in what I represent, who wear my colors, who think heroes are real because of what I do in that ring." Hulk paused, letting the weight of his achievements sink in before delivering the devastating comparison. "What have you got, Jake? A pet snake and a reputation for scaring people? You're 40 years old and your greatest accomplishment is making other wrestlers nervous about sharing a locker room with you?" The comprehensive nature of Hulk's response demonstrated exactly why he'd become more than just a successful wrestler. He understood that Jake's attack wasn't really about courage. It was about jealousy, insecurity, and resentment over the different paths their careers had taken. Jake had chosen to cultivate darkness and fear, while Hulk had chosen to inspire hope and heroism. "And you know what the really pathetic part is, "Jake, you are one of the most psychologically sophisticated performers I've ever seen. Your mind games are brilliant. Your ability to get inside people's heads is unmatched in this business. Your character work is some of the most complex and nuanced storytelling in wrestling. You could have used those skills to build something positive, to create characters and storylines that elevated this entire business. Instead, you chose to waste your talent trying to tear down what other people built." Several wrestlers exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something historically significant. This wasn't just one performer responding to another's challenge. This was a masterclass in professional psychology, being delivered by someone who clearly understood both the wrestling business and human nature better than almost anyone else. Jake's face had gone through a series of expressions during Hulk's response, from initial confidence to growing uncertainty, to something that looked suspiciously like genuine respect, mixed with deep embarrassment. He'd come into this confrontation, expecting to demonstrate his superior psychological skills, expecting to reduce the great Hulk Hogan to the scared little boy he claimed to see beneath the heroic exterior. Instead, he was discovering that Hulk operated on a level of understanding that went far beyond what most people realized. Jake was learning that true psychological sophistication isn't about manipulating people's fears. It's about understanding their motivations and helping them become better versions of themselves. "You called me a scared little boy, Jake. But scared little boys don't stand up to bullies. Scared little boys don't take responsibility for an entire industry. Scared little boys don't look someone like you in the eye and tell them exactly what they need to hear, even when they don't want to hear it. And scared little boys don't offer to help someone who just attacked them become better at their craft." The silence that followed was different from the 6 minutes that had begun this confrontation. This was the silence of someone processing a fundamental shift in their understanding of both themselves and the person standing in front of them. Jake was realizing that he'd spent years cultivating an image of psychological superiority while missing the deeper truth about what real strength actually means. Finally, Jake spoke, and his voice carried none of its usual menace or psychological manipulation. The practiced intimidation was gone, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like genuine vulnerability. "Hulk, he started, then stopped, apparently unable to find words that adequately responded to what he'd just experienced. This was Jake Roberts, master of psychological warfare, rendered speechless by someone he'd tried to dismiss as a simple good guy character. "I was wrong," Jake finally managed, his voice much quieter than anyone who knew him would have expected. "That was completely out of line. You're not scared of anything, and I had no right to say that. I was projecting my own insecurities onto you because I couldn't handle the fact that you've achieved something I never could." The apology was simple and direct, without any of the complex psychological games that usually characterized Jake's speech. It was the kind of straightforward acknowledgement that demonstrated genuine respect and recognition of superior wisdom. Hulk nodded once, accepting the apology with the grace of someone who understood that this confrontation had never really been about personal animosity. It was about respect, recognition, and two very different approaches to professional wrestling finding common ground in their shared love for the business. "Apology accepted," Hulk said simply. "Now let's figure out how to use your psychological skills and my connection with the audience to create something that makes this business better instead of wasting energy on this kind of pointless conflict." The transformation was immediate and remarkable. In the space of less than 8 minutes, a potentially destructive confrontation had become the foundation for what would develop into one of wrestling's most effective creative partnerships. Hulk extended his hand, and Jake shook it with the firm grip of someone who had just learned a valuable lesson about the difference between being feared and being respected. Over the next several months, Hulk and Jake would work together on storylines that utilized both of their unique strengths. Hulk's heroic charisma and ability to inspire audiences, combined with Jake's psychological sophistication and understanding of human motivation. Their collaborative work would create some of the most psychologically complex and emotionally satisfying storylines of the 1980s wrestling boom. The wrestling business is built on manufactured conflict, predetermined outcomes, and carefully crafted personas that blur the line between reality and performance. But sometimes, in the quiet spaces between matches, away from cameras and crowds, genuine human moments occur that transcend the artifice of sports entertainment. Jake Roberts came into that backstage corridor, believing he could use his psychological expertise to diminish Hulk Hogan, to expose what he assumed was a shallow character built on marketing rather than substance. Instead, he discovered that true psychological sophistication isn't about exploiting people's weaknesses. It's about recognizing their strengths and helping them flourish. Years later, wrestling historians would debate whether that backstage confrontation was a turning point in both men's careers. Jake would admit in interviews that his encounter with Hulk taught him more about the wrestling business than any match or promo he'd ever done, while Hulk would credit his partnership with Jake as helping him develop the kind of sophisticated psychology that elevated his performances beyond simple good versus evil storytelling. The wrestling business benefited enormously from their collaboration, as audiences got to see two completely different approaches to entertainment working together rather than against each other. Their storylines combined Hulk's inspirational heroism with Jake's psychological complexity, creating a template for how wrestling could satisfy both mainstream audiences and longtime enthusiasts without compromising either vision. But it all started in that backstage corridor, when Jake Roberts learned that calling someone a scared little boy can be extremely dangerous when that person responds not with fear or anger, but with 6 minutes of silence followed by a systematic demonstration of why courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. The lesson was clear in professional wrestling, as in life. True strength isn't about intimidating others or playing mind games. It's about understanding yourself and others well enough to transform conflict into collaboration, and enemies into allies who make each other better than they ever could have been alone.